Hello friends, I am Rob, here in my lair. And I come before you as Rob today, not as OmnusI, because this is a little bit different from what I've made in the past. This is called Confessions of a Humbled Game Master, for a very good reason. You see, usually when I'm present as OmnusI, I'm speaking from a voice of authority, of a veteran game master who maintains a level of objectivity and tries to bring insight and balance and things to the hobby of gaming, where there oftentimes seem to not be very much of any of that. And that's always been something I've been attempting to cultivate, as an image of acceptance and bringing people into the hobby in a healthy and open way, and to be a voice against bigotry and gatekeeping and all the other negative things that can crop up in as diverse a hobby as we have, honestly. So, as OmnusI, I work very hard to make videos that help people, that include people, that entertain if I can, but in ways that I can give good content. And in order to do that, I take the voice of an authority, somebody who is an elder, and a lot of times wisdom and experience come at a painful cost. It's true. I don't dwell on that much as OmnusI, but as Rob, I'm very aware of various missteps and mistakes that I've made in my past. I own these mistakes, but I don't dwell on them overly much, but I've learned from them. And I thought it might be a healthy thing, if not necessarily always a good thing, but a healthy thing. For those of you, my subscribers and viewers of my little channel, whom, I'm very grateful for, and I respect, and in my own way I love very much, that all of you have come and taken the time to watch this video and other videos that I've made. It's good to know the human behind the hat, and I'm just going to give this a shot and see what people think. Without any hedging or anything like that, I'm just going to tell you the situation. I'll let you, for the most part, draw your own conclusions, and I'm not going to try to defend myself. Some of the things that I have done, were very regrettable. Some of them have been over the course of a long period of time. Such is the topic for today, which is relatively tame. This is something I'm going to have to work up to before I get to my greatest sins that I'll confess. First one, I generally attempt, as much as I can, to espouse that a multitude of games are a good thing. People who spend their entire gaming career only playing one game are doing themselves a disservice. There's a lot of voices out there, and listening to a variety of voices strengthens a person's experience in the hobby and can lead to some fantastic experiences outside of what's possible with just one game system. That's a belief that I've had for quite some time. Even though my own library doesn't have a huge range of depth, I generally try to take the point that no one system is bad. And even though I don't particularly care for a particular game system, I also try to refrain from painting it with a black brush in front of others, or in some ways lessening it in a public space. If people ask me for my personal opinion about a game, I'll freely document what I think are deficiencies in game systems, or ways that particular game systems impact its players and users in a negative fashion. There aren't very many of those, fortunately. Gaming is generally a good thing, and there's only a few that really have some kind of decrepitude built into them. But I do have my biases. I'm human. And one of my biases, one of my very earliest biases, I will confess that I held onto a deep bias and grudge against FASA's Star Trek role-playing game. Now, what brings this to light is I have a friend. He goes under the YouTube moniker the Fat Man GM. We've collaborated here and there on a few small projects, but he's a man who has I hold a lot of respect for. And he has, and while he doesn't run it, he has a great deal of love, and his perspective gives him a lot of praise to be heaped upon this game. My background, on the other hand, I am a bit younger than Rick is, and my experience with the game is a box set that my father got. My father was a big Star Trek fan. Not the kind of person you'd ever expect to play role-playing games. He didn't, to my knowledge, have that kind of imagination. He was, more practical. One of the ways that my father and I didn't see eye to eye. And he got a box set. I still remember the black packaging, silver foil signature by James Doohan, Scott, the actor for Scotty. And it was the Star Trek role-playing game. A picture of Spock, Kirk, and McCoy on the cover, for those of you who are familiar with the original series. This came out in the early 80s, I believe. This was way before The Next Generation or Deep Space Nine or any of the stuff that came after that. The only resources they had to draw from was the original TV show, which was somewhat limited because of the restriction of the budget of that show, and also the fairly narrow vision that the writers of that show took, with Gene Roddenberry's vision of a very optimistic humanity. And it created many of the sci-fi tropes that we understand today. Things like teleporters and matter recombinators and things like that are a lot of cases. Maybe they weren't originally, dreamed up from that show, but it came into the public eye and the public imaginations through Star Trek. And while my father had me watch quite a bit of the original series. It wasn't a series that I was vastly in love with. It was entertaining enough, but I didn't hate it, but it wasn't really what... I was far more inspired by something like Star Wars than I was Star Trek. And if you think that is the basis of my bias against the game, you're wrong, but we'll get to that. So, my father got this game, and I was interested in role-playing games. So I appropriated it. I don't think he cared. I don't know if he ever read any of the books. So I really doubt he did. That wasn't something he was interested in. Even towards the, throughout his life as I knew him, I don't think he would have ever had the capacity to care about a role-playing game the way that I certainly did. So I absconded with the book. He might have even given them to me. I don't remember at this point. I hope he did, but I just don't remember. So I took the books and I read them. The books had what I have come to realize is a fairly simple early role-playing game system. Everything is based off of percentile dice rolls. You have your skills, which range from minuscule in the low double digits to up to 100, which means you're almost guaranteed at doing anything of common difficulty. And it had listings for the various weapons. Not a great number, because if you have weapons that can go pew, you're disintegrated. You don't really need a lot of range. Star Trek of the Federation, as I remember, only had 3 main weapons. They had the little tiny handheld phaser, which could primarily stun, but it was capable of injuring somebody. You had the hand grip phaser, which had the little one clapped on top of it to give it more power and range. And then they had a clunky, very clunky looking phaser rifle, which was, again, the pistol grip, slap on a stock and a barrel for longer range and more power. I think it was only shown in 2 or 3 episodes of the original series, maybe a movie. But those were the weapons. And again, there are only real differences in the different sizes. They all had multiple settings, from heat settings, stun settings, disrupt, doing real structural damage, to vaporize. It had specs on the various other races. It had the Klingons and their disruptor weapons, which are considered barbaric and cruel by Federation standards. They had Romulan weapons too, but a lot of the races, as was understood through the movie, were more mysterious. Klingons and Romulans were the faces that you knew, but there were also specs on Tholians and Gorns and Orions and realistically, there wasn't as great of a range as there were for further iterations of Star Trek, but it was enough to give a solid role-playing game around it. Enough resources. It had a number of races, including Acacian, which are basically cat people. And I honestly don't remember them from the original series, but I do remember them from the cartoon that came after. I think there was a character who was of that race. Of course, there were Vulcans and Andorians and a few other races. But to me, the percentile system didn't thrill me. But that really wasn't what stuck in my craw about the game system. The whole concept of Star Trek in general, to me, was flat and uninteresting on a couple of reasons. If everything went ideally in the Star Trek universe, no conflict would ever happen. You'd resolve everything without a single combat dice roll. And some of these shows were kind of like that. In some cases, Kirk never threw a punch and nobody ever fired a phaser because diplomacy won out or the aliens were so powerful that their weapons didn't matter. And a lot of what Star Trek to me was setting challenges by telling you what didn't work. Oh, you have a target that you need to get out of a dangerous situation. Of course there's going to be some reason why you can't just use your transporters and beam them on board. Oh, there's a whole block of an enemy that you have to deal with. Well, there's certainly going to be a reason why you can't fire your shipboard phasers and knock out an entire block and take care of the situation with a single button press. Oh, you need to get information about this world. Well, just so happens their atmosphere happens to have the material in it that blocks sensor reading, so you have to physically send an away team down. There's always another excuse to send an away team down, always another excuse for the technology to not just be able to wave your hand and fix it, despite the fact that that's clearly what that technology is capable of doing most of the time. And I was rather young. I was a teenager, late teenager, early college. At the time I was, coming to grips with this game. I ran a game of it briefly in high school when I was at the seminary in my sophomore year. And it blew. It was not good. My players didn't buy into it because we were from the Dungeons and Dragons era. We were all about killing the monsters and accomplishing the goal and saving things and doing stuff like that. When it came to Prime Directive, and it really didn't excite anybody. And so when I tried running this game, it quite quickly became clear that Starfleet's edicts about what you can and can't do, they didn't work for the sentiments of a group of teenagers who are used to dungeon crawling and running in fantasy adventures. And even to this day, I still see it as a great challenge. It involves artificial constraints. Not doing what you can do because there are reasons not to. Not always reasons that are framed by the physics of the world, but by rules and guidelines that you have to follow. Most role-playing games, your group stands outside of the law a lot of times to accomplish what you're going to do. Shadowrun, you do things that are illegal a lot, breaking and entering, murder, things like that. Dungeons and Dragons, you solve a lot of your problems with your swords, which in a polite society you shouldn't do. You can go on and on and on. There are only a relatively small number of games where you operate within the law. One I can think of is Legend of the Five Rings, for example, where you are warriors dealing with things as warriors do often. And even then, a lot of times you're probably skirting the law. So, I blanched at FASA's iteration of Star Trek. The one thing I remember favorably about it is they had a really kick-butt war game that came with it, where they had a large hex map and a whole pile of chits, and you could very well represent starship on starship combat, which to me was the most exciting part of the whole thing. How many times did we play where we actually did not use the role-playing game, but here's your ship, here's our ships or the enemy ships, and you're going to have to deal with them, with photon torpedoes flying and banks of phasers and tracking damage and balancing out how you're going to move versus how you're going to fire and allocating your energy. It was a really good, rugged system that could account for a large number of familiar ships from the game and some they created for the game. And I thought that was an entertaining, but, relatively thin. It was a war game that came with a role-playing game. And the role-playing game's connection to that was brutal. They had a set of rules where you could play as the bridge crew, and everybody had a role. Some people, like the helmsman, had great roles. They would move the ship and fire the weapons. One person did all of that. Everyone else did things like tracking casualties, making a sensors roll to get scans of the enemy ship. That was it. I mean, if you were the science officer or communications, you were a passive participant in a lot of the fights. The engineer could be a complete tyrant. They determined who got what. So, well, you irritate me, you're not getting power to your thing. And they had to try to figure out how to make the points work out. You had so many points by your engines, and you portioned out those points to weapon systems and shields and movement. And so ultimately, if you worked together, it was cool for the 3 or 4 people who actually did things. Everybody else, if you were playing with a larger group, people were just going to sit there. You'd almost have to rotate to give everybody a chance to do stuff, which probably could have worked, I guess. I don't know. Never really got to that point, though, because the one time we tried it, it just was so ugly, and the engineer was a tyrant. He was purposefully being a big jerk about giving out power and holding it back from some people. So that did happen. The one time I remember playing it. So I lost the game eventually. I moved several times through high school, home life, and college. And at some point I lost the box set. I regret it. Not strictly because of the role-playing game, which I do have a decent collection of role-playing games. I mostly regret it because it was something of my father's that I'll never be able to get back. And I'm a bit sad about that. I do kind of have a hope that I might have brought it over to a friend's who, in his time when he moved, he sold a lot of the stuff back to the local game store. And I may have to go in and see if he's got it. It's the only thing I can think of. Otherwise, it's been lost in any number of moves. But if I can find a tattered old box with tattered old pages in the books and stuff, maybe with my name on it, or, yeah, who knows. So at any rate, now I'm me. I am, well into my 40s, and my gaming style has changed drastically. I favor more narrative styles of games. Rules are something to be tinkered with, ignored if needed, and I have a firm belief that you can take even the worst game system, and if you have a good game master, you could turn it into something good. That's been proven before. Also in Star Trek, by the way. One of my, good friends, Larry, I hope he doesn't mind me using his real name, but, he is a huge Star Trek fan. And he invited myself and my roommate at the time, my other good friend, to play in a game. And I'm like, Star Trek? I don't really like Star Trek. And he sold it to me that we weren't just going to be playing Starfleet. We were going to be playing Starfleet Black Ops, doing the kind of dirty stuff the Federation needs to be done, but needs to keep it out of the public eye. And that was kind of an interesting idea. And then at the same time, taking the technology of Star Trek and all of a sudden bending it to that bent, that actually made for an entertaining game. Now, the game itself that we used, the rules were terrible for it. I can't remember the company, Decipher, Catalyst, something. But basically the crux of the system was you had varying levels of skill. For as many points of skill as you had in whatever you were trying to do, you rolled that many six-sided dice and you would take the best. And each task had a target number. Well, we kind of broke the game. Our characters were fairly skilled, and we realized right away this was a game that had a wild die. One of your dice was designated to be the wild die. If you rolled a 6 on that die, you would either get to roll it again, or you would add the next another die from the pool to it, so that you would have a number greater than 6. We quickly found out that for most things that we would try, we had a 1 in 6 chance of succeeding, because if the wild die was a 6, we would succeed almost no matter what, and if it was less than 6, we would almost certainly succeed because we had 4s and 5s and 6s and just about everything. So it came down to a 1 in 6 chance of doing almost anything we wanted to do. So we would do ridiculously difficult things because we were pretty sure that as long as we kept the difficulty to heroic, which was in the 8 or 9 range, we had a 1 in 6 chance of doing it no matter what. So we broke that. If I'm misrepresenting the rules, it's what we used. I didn't read the books very much. I just played because I wasn't all that interested in the rules. I was more interested in the story that Larry spun, which was pretty good. It was enough to keep me engaged, and I wasn't a huge Star Trek fan, but we did some pretty cool things in that universe. Even though we couldn't beam down most of the time, we couldn't scan through things most of the time, and there were barriers that stopped us from just cranking up our phasers up to maximum setting and vaporizing the daylights out of whatever was in front of us. Although we did that a lot. But he told a very entertaining story that lasted more than a year, maybe 2 years, possibly. And the characters, no, they probably weren't the deepest characters that you'll find in Star Trek. The game system didn't really warrant having a very deep system, but our characters were really good at what they did, and we did some stupid, crazy things, and had a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. Larry was a good game master who told a good story about what he was really passionate about. So, even though I'm middling on Star Trek, and again, full confession, I've never seen more than parts of an episode of Voyager, maybe seen 5 or 6 episodes of Deep Space Nine, which to me is the most interesting of the lot. Not that I'm passionate about it or anything, it seemed like an interesting slice of life outside of mainstream Starfleet. More of your feel for the pulse of what actually goes on in the Star Trek universe, not just what's on the ship life on Starfleet. I've never seen Enterprise. I've never seen... Was there a Discovery? Some other show? I haven't seen it. I'm really not interested for the most part. But I can confess, I have, over time, whenever anybody would pop up about fastest Star Trek, or Star Trek role-playing game in general, I've always been very, very harshly critical. Part of it was my failing to kind of understand what they were shooting for, and my failure to appreciate the challenges that running a game like that engenders. Stopping your players from trampling all over your system just because the technology says they can, and trampling over your worlds and your challenges for the same reason. It's tough. It's a tough game to do, because your players have to be invested in being, in that game, for the most part, Starfleet. Tying yourselves down to... people don't like alignment in role-playing games anymore. Alignment is a tricky thing where it says, because I am lawful neutral, for example, I will act a particular, predictable way because that's how a lawful neutral person acts. A lot of people, that really sticks in their craw. Even worse, in my mind, is where Federation has all these rules and things, and some of them are seemingly really, really confining. Whereas, if you go into a situation, there's combat coming because you know the tells that a combat's coming, but you shoot first, you could be demoted. You can be kicked out of Starfleet if if you use the weapons that you've got that Starfleet has given you and you vaporize some guy. Phew. And try to get away from the notice of doing bad things. Again, the technology works against you there too. So I can appreciate now how more challenging it is to play the game and to play and to run the game. It's a tricky game to do. But now that I'm older and now that I'm wiser, I do come to regret how harshly I've judged it in the past, and even the fairly recent past, honestly. I didn't think there were a lot of people who really loved that game. I didn't. You rarely hear about it. It is not one of the bell cows of role-playing. It's not even mentioned in the top 20 on most people's radar. On almost anybody's radar, to be honest, unless you already really loved that game system or had some fond past memories of it. Most people, yeah. Fast Lost Star is long faded. That game, I'm sure you can still find things for it. I never see them in the trades and the buy-sell trade sites. But you know what? I'm going to have to look back, and I'm going to have to possibly go back to try to exorcise some of my demons of my past. And maybe that's a system I'm going to have to look for and try to wrestle with one more time. I'm Rob. This has been my gaming confession. Thank you for watching, and I hope you stay tuned. If you enjoyed this from this humble game master, I hope you like and subscribe and come and see me again here in my lair for further videos. Thank you, and have many more successful adventures wherever they take you.